negative response must include the illogical Jude Kelly.
It began like any other quiet day within the fortress-like walls of Windsor. To the outside world, the palace stood as it always had, a symbol of continuity, tradition, and unshakable stability. The sun had just started to filter through tall windows, casting soft golden streaks across centuries-old stone, as though nothing within could ever be disturbed. But appearances can be deceptive, and sometimes the most earth-shattering moments arrive in places thought immune to chaos. That morning was supposed to be ordinary, even forgettable, yet what took place in a single corridor would fracture the carefully constructed illusion that Britain's most powerful family had worked tirelessly to maintain. A scream, sharp, unmistakable, and carrying with it the weight of buried history, cut through the silence, and then a child's name. It happened in the East Wing, a part of the palace where history seemed to breathe from the walls. Generations of monarchs had paced there, portraits of kings and queens watching with silent judgment, like a jury that had never disbanded. The corridor had seen its share of whispers, tears, and small victories, but nothing could have prepared those who were present for what was about to unfold. The scream wasn't the kind born of pain or fear. It was the kind that comes from a place deeper, from tension suppressed for too long, erupting in an instant that no one could have anticipated. And when it echoed down the marble floors, it shattered more than the atmosphere. It broke the illusion of harmony. The voice belonged to Queen Camilla, and what she said wasn't just words spoken in haste. They carried venom, carried history, carried all the shadows of a name she wished she could silence forever. Her words weren't directed at a rival or an adult she might spar with behind closed doors. They were fired toward someone much younger, someone who had never lived through the battles that had scarred the monarchy's past. The target was Princess Charlotte. Those who were there say it happened almost too quickly to process. One moment the corridor was filled with the soft murmur of polite conversation and the cheerful sound of children at play. The next, Camilla's voice sliced through the air with such force that everyone froze in place. A single sentence, loud and unrestrained, carried a weight no child should have to bear. The look on Charlotte's face, startled, pale, her small hands tightening at her sides, was enough to silence even the busiest staff member mid-step. No one moved, no one breathed. The outburst did more than wound a child. It cracked the fragile mask of civility that the royal household had been polishing for decades. What had long been whispered behind closed doors, the resentments, the unresolved grief, the tensions stitched together for the sake of public unity, suddenly spilled into the open. This wasn't a matter of protocol or palace etiquette. This was something far more human, far more dangerous. A child had unknowingly touched a nerve buried deep within the Queen, and in doing so had exposed just how fragile the balance of this family truly was. And then, just as quickly as it began, the silence returned. But it wasn't the calm, dignified silence the palace was accustomed to. It was a suffocating stillness, heavy with disbelief and fear. The staff who witnessed it exchanged no words, only glances that spoke of their shared understanding. What had just occurred could not be undone. Whatever was spoken in that moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the East Wing. It was the kind of rupture that history does not forget. For Princess Charlotte, it was more than a moment of shock. It was the realization that even within her own family, the people she was told to admire and respect were capable of sudden, inexplicable cruelty. She stood there not as a princess in line to the throne, but as a little girl caught in the storm of adult tempers she could not possibly comprehend. And for those watching, the image of a child shrinking back beneath the weight of a queen's voice would not fade easily. But if Camilla thought her words would stay buried in that corridor, she was mistaken, because what came next would change everything. Prince William, a man who had spent his life carefully navigating between duty and emotion, was only rooms away. And the instant he laid eyes on his daughter's face, pale, shaken, but resolute, something within him shifted. This wasn't a prince weighing protocol. This was a father, awakened in the most primal way imaginable. The gathering that day had been meant to symbolize unity, a rare moment of private family togetherness. Instead, it had exposed fault lines running beneath the monarchy's foundations. In one scream, one name, the past and present collided, and William's reaction would ensure it could never be hidden again. The morning had begun as these royal gatherings often do, cloaked in ceremony so subtle it feels natural, yet carefully, staged to keep tensions hidden beneath a polished surface. Windsor Castle, with its sprawling courtyards and ancient stone, hummed with quiet purpose. Every clock ticked in harmony with a schedule meticulously drawn up weeks in advance. Lunch had been planned in one of the lighter rooms, meant to feel casual, an illusion of family normalcy that rarely existed in truth. It wasn't a banquet. No gilded carriages or red carpets, no cameras poised to capture orchestrated smiles. This was meant to be private, stripped down, an attempt at kinship that had become rarer with each passing year. The family had been thinning, reshaped by departures and divides. Old loyalties had been tested, new alliances formed. It was no secret to those within the walls that gatherings like this were less about warmth and more about maintenance, keeping the machine intact, oiling the gears of a family business that spanned centuries. Yet, to the outside world, these lunches carried the illusion of ordinary domesticity, the simple act of family coming together over a meal. And that illusion had to be preserved at all costs. Into this carefully constructed scene walked Princess Charlotte. At 8 years old, she carried herself with a composure that startled even the most seasoned staff. Dressed in a soft pastel, blue dress chosen by Catherine with the kind of care only a mother can bring, she looked both delicate and quietly confident. Charlotte had grown into her role in recent months, her natural poise reminding many of the grandmothers she had never known, Diana. There was a spark in her eyes, inquisitive, mischievous at times, but underpinned by curiosity about the world she had been born into. She was no longer content with just being a child in the background. She asked questions. She wanted to know about the portraits on the walls, about the lives behind the gilded frames. She wanted to understand. That morning she had charmed the staff as she often did. A smile here, a greeting there, a perfect curtsy when required. She had moved through the halls with ease, weaving between worlds, a little girl at heart, but also a princess acutely aware of the expectations placed on her small shoulders. Catherine watched her daughter closely, proud yet cautious, knowing that innocence in the palace is always fleeting. William, too, noticed the growing maturity in Charlotte, a reminder of the late mother who still haunted his thoughts. Then there was Queen Camilla. She had arrived earlier, escorted by aides who carried themselves with the precision of people long used to walking in shadows. Camilla was polished as always, her face set in that practiced neutrality perfected over decades, of standing in rooms where she was tolerated more than welcomed. She had learned the art of invisibility, of blending warmth with distance, ensuring that she neither alienated nor drew too much attention. But on this day, something in her demeanor faltered. She didn't speak as much. Her smile was thinner, strained. The glass of water brought to her sat untouched. Her replies to passing staff were clipped, her eyes restless, darting more than usual. One maid would later remark that the queen looked tight in the face but tense in the eyes. The rest of the family began gathering by midday in the sunlit corridor of the East Wing, the chosen space before moving into lunch. The children played quietly nearby, their laughter faint but steady under the watch of nannies. Adults hovered, in polite clusters, exchanging conversations about upcoming engagements, diplomatic schedules, even something as ordinary as the progress of a garden renovation. It was light chatter, intentionally mundane, the sort of talk that papers over what everyone knows lies beneath. The portraits along the walls, sovereigns past, painted with regal composure, looked down like silent witnesses. Their presence always loomed, as though reminding each royal that history would not forget their missteps. To an outsider, nothing about the scene would have raised alarm. There was order, calm, a familiar rhythm. But to those attuned to the palace's subtleties, something felt off. The air was too heavy, the smiles a fraction too rigid, the laughter a bit too rehearsed. Even the silence between words seemed to linger longer than usual. It was the kind of atmosphere that precedes a storm, unnoticed until the first crack of thunder. Charlotte, unaware of what was building, skipped lightly across the marble floor to join her brothers. Her voice, cheerful and clear, carried briefly through the corridor. She spoke with the innocent authority only a child possesses, weaving in bits of observation she had collected from the walls around her. Catherine caught her daughter's words and smiled, proud of her interest, though she glanced around to make sure her curiosity wouldn't tread on the wrong ground. William, deep in quiet conversation, noted it too, but said nothing. For both parents, Charlotte's spirit was a gift, a reminder of Diana's light in their own daughter's laughter. But for Camilla, each word from the little girl landed differently. What seemed innocent to others scraped raw at old wounds. She remained, poised, but those who later replayed the moment in their minds recalled that her grip on the arm of her chair tightened. Her jaw clenched. Her composure cracked, just slightly, but enough to show something unspoken simmering beneath the surface. It was only a matter of time before the carefully staged scene unraveled. The East Wing corridor, bathed in sunlight, lined with monarchs of the past, was about to witness a rupture it would carry like a scar. It happened faster than anyone could have predicted. One moment, the East Wing corridor carried the pleasant rhythm of polite chatter, punctuated by the soft giggles of children. The next, that rhythm shattered. A voice, sharp and unmistakably forceful, cut through the air with the precision of a blade. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A footman carrying silver trays nearly stumbled. Even the laughter of the children died in an instant. The sound came not from the playful chaos of youth, but from authority, from power. It was the voice of Queen Camilla. Her words were not rehearsed or measured. They carried no trace of the careful diplomacy she had mastered over the years. This was raw, unfiltered emotion. "Don't you ever mention her name again." The words ricocheted off the marble walls, echoing louder than they had been spoken, as though the palace itself wanted to remember them. Princess Charlotte stood frozen, her small frame caught in the center of a storm she did not summon. She had not shouted, had not disobeyed. Her crime was simple, too simple, an innocent remark, perhaps repeated from earlier that morning, when her eyes lingered on the familiar portrait of Diana in the powder blue suit. What was meant as admiration, as a child's attempt to connect to the grandmother she never met, had now unleashed something buried deep within Camilla. Charlotte's shoes scuffed lightly against the marble as she instinctively stepped backward. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the silence that swallowed the room after the outburst. But those who heard it said it was haunting. The retreat of a child, confused and stunned, shrinking back not from a stranger, but from someone meant to command respect. Her lips parted slightly as though searching for words, but nothing came. Her eyes, wide and pale, carried the weight of betrayal. She was too young to understand all the layers, but she understood fear, and that was enough to still her completely. The staff who witnessed it found themselves paralyzed. These were men and women trained to remain invisible, to anticipate the needs of royalty without intruding, to carry secrets to their graves. Yet, in that moment, they felt the atmosphere shift so dramatically that invisibility became impossible. Their eyes darted to one another, wide with disbelief, but their lips remained sealed. To intervene was unthinkable. To react was dangerous, and so they stood, like statues carved into the palace itself, watching a rupture they could never unsee. Camilla herself seemed to realize almost instantly the gravity of her words. For a heartbeat, her face revealed something rarely seen. Panic. Not fear of the child, nor even fear of the moment, but fear of what it revealed about her own cracks. She had tried for decades to bury Diana's shadow, to quiet whispers, to erase comparisons. Yet here it was, thrown back at her not by an enemy or critic, but by the innocent voice of a child. And her mask had slipped. She turned sharply, skirts brushing against the polished floor, and without a word more, disappeared into one of the adjoining private rooms. The door closed with a muted thud, but to those standing nearby, it sounded like finality, a retreat into the safety of walls that could not bear witness. She had left the corridor behind, but the damage lingered, blooming silently like cracks spreading through glass. Princess Charlotte remained where she was, near the tall bay windows, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her breathing quickened, though she tried to steady it. She had inherited her mother's quiet resilience, her father's stubbornness, but none of that shielded her from the sting of an adult's fury. She didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she stood rigid, her silence louder than tears would have been. For those who saw her, the image was unforgettable. A child silenced not by protocol, but by pain. The corridor, once a place of quiet elegance, had turned into a void. The portraits of monarchs past seemed to loom heavier over the moment, as if those painted eyes were judging the exchange. Their gaze, stern and eternal, bore witness to yet another fracture in the House of Windsor. The faint hum of staff retreating to avoid attention was the only sound left. It was as though the building itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Far away, in another room, Prince William was finishing a call with the Prime Minister. His voice, moments earlier calm and composed, still carried the polished diplomacy expected of a future king. But as he ended the call and stepped into the corridor, his world changed. He did not yet hear the exact words. He did not need to. He saw his daughter standing pale and shaken, and instantly he knew. Something had happened that would not be easily forgotten. The scream was over, but its echoes were only beginning. Prince William's footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor as he left the drawing room, a folder of notes tucked under his arm. Just moments earlier, his voice had carried the calm cadence of diplomacy, ending a routine call with the Prime Minister. But as soon as he stepped into the corridor, the air felt different. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, stifling, charged with something that made him pause instinctively. He glanced ahead and saw Charlotte. The sight of her standing alone, small and pale against the backdrop of towering windows, froze him in place. Her posture told the story before her lips ever could. Her tiny fists were clenched tightly at her sides, her eyes blinking too quickly as though fighting back tears she didn't want to show. William knew that look. He had worn it himself once as a boy when the weight of palace life became too much to bear. He didn't need to ask what had happened to know something sacred had been crossed. His heart dropped. In that instant, the folder slipped from his hand, forgotten on a side table. His pace quickened, and in just a few strides he was kneeling, before his daughter. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms. Charlotte didn't resist, but she didn't melt into him either. She stood rigid, trembling faintly, as though afraid that giving in to comfort might reveal weakness. William tightened his embrace, his chin brushing the crown of her hair. To the staff nearby, the gesture was shocking in its intimacy. Royals were rarely so unguarded, even in private. But William was not thinking as a prince. He was thinking as a father. He didn't rush her. He didn't fill the silence with questions. He simply held her until her breathing steadied. Until the rigidity in her small frame softened just enough for her to lean against him. It was only then that he pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "What happened, darling?" he asked, his voice low, almost breaking. Charlotte's lips quivered, but no tears came. She was determined to stay strong, even now. "Nothing," she whispered at first, the instinct of a child taught to be cautious with words. But William knew better. He had been raised in the same halls, taught the same silences. He had spent much of his youth learning what not to say, what not to feel. And seeing that instinct already forming in his daughter tore at him. He stroked her cheek gently. "You can tell me," he said. "You can always tell me." The staff lingered in the background, uneasy, exchanging nervous glances. They knew something serious had occurred, but none dared intervene. Their loyalty was not to one side or the other, but to the preservation of the moment. They stood like shadows along the edges of the corridor, bearing silent witness as history once again unfolded in front of them. Charlotte swallowed hard before speaking, her voice barely audible. "She shouted at me," she said softly. William's face tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "I didn't do anything wrong. I only said—" Her words faltered, the memory too raw. William smoothed her hair, waiting patiently. "You only said what, sweetheart?" When she didn't answer, he didn't push. Instead, he simply drew her back into his arms, holding her with the fierce protectiveness that only comes when a father sees his child wounded. In that embrace, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about an outburst. This wasn't about palace etiquette or protocol. This was about his daughter, and the shadow of his past reaching forward to hurt her. The corridor around them remained silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer carried the weight of shock. It carried the weight of expectation. Those watching knew that William's next steps would matter. He was not a man known for rash decisions, nor for letting emotion steer him publicly. But now, emotion was unavoidable. What he chose to do next would ripple far beyond these walls. For William, the decision crystallized quickly. He kissed Charlotte's forehead, stood, and turned toward the staff. His voice, calm but firm, carried none of the hesitation that so often plagued palace confrontations. "Where is she?" he asked. No one needed clarification. A footman, pale and nervous, lifted a hand and gestured toward the drawing room, where Camilla had retreated minutes earlier. William nodded once. He didn't storm. He didn't raise his voice. But each step he took toward that door carried the weight of something undeniable. The father had awakened. And, for the first time in years, he was not walking as a prince bound by protocol. He was walking as Diana's son. The staff held their breath as he approached, their eyes darting between his steady stride and the closed door that concealed the queen. They knew the walls were about to absorb words they were never meant to hear, words that could alter the balance of a family and a monarchy. And yet, no one moved to stop him. No one could. The corridor stretched ahead, long and unyielding, lined with portraits of sovereigns and saints. Their painted eyes seemed to follow William as he advanced, their presence a reminder of the centuries of restraint demanded of those who walked these halls. But William's mind was not on history, nor on tradition.